No one told him to stay quiet. No rule was announced, no boundaries spoken aloud. The room remained calm, orderly, almost gentle. Smiles moved easily across faces. Concern sounded sincere. And yet, something irreversible had already taken place. This was not the kind of silence that follows understanding. It was the kind that settles in when people assume it will never be challenged. While every adult present mistook that quiet for agreement, one child felt the shift immediately. This story does not begin with conflict or confrontation. It begins with a moment so subtle it went unnoticed by most, the moment silence stopped being chosen and started being expected. Silence had always been a discipline for William Carter. It was something he carried with intention, shaped by years of experience and reflection. He had learned long ago that restraint often protected outcomes better than urgency. Words, when used carelessly, could harden positions. Systems, when honored, could correct course without damage. Paperwork mattered to him because it created clarity. Order mattered because it removed chaos. He trusted timing and process more than impulse or performance, and that trust had guided him through decades of responsibility. William's days moved with quiet precision. Documents were reviewed carefully, records kept meticulously, routines followed without deviation. His pace was deliberate, never rushed, never hesitant. His mind remained sharp, grounded in habit and awareness. There was nothing about his presence that suggested decline or confusion. Yet the very calm that once defined his authority slowly began to invite assumption. Silence, once understood as choice, became something others felt entitled to interpret. His daughter, Evelyn Carter, lived by a different rhythm. Confident, efficient, and socially protected, she moved easily through spaces where decisions were expected to be made quickly. In her world, effectiveness was measured by momentum. Strength revealed itself through immediacy. Silence was rarely neutral. It was a pause that needed direction, a gap to be filled. This belief was not rooted in cruelty. It was reinforced by environments where speaking first often meant leading and where hesitation was mistaken for uncertainty. The setting where this shift occurred felt ordinary, even familiar. A family space shaped by years of shared history, where roles had settled naturally and hierarchy felt unspoken but understood. Evelyn's tone remained polite. Her expressions stayed warm. Her concerns sounded reasonable, even caring. She never explicitly asked William to step aside or remain quiet. She simply moved forward as though his silence had already been agreed upon. Decisions were summarized rather than discussed. Outcomes were announced rather than shaped together. There were no insults exchanged. No raised voices disrupted the calm. Smiles softened every directive, making authority feel gentle instead of forceful. Concern replaced consultation. Efficiency replaced permission. In this atmosphere, nothing appeared confrontational, and that was precisely what allowed the shift to go unnoticed. Silence was not requested. It was assumed, and assumption, when repeated often enough, becomes expectation. William did not defend himself. He did not interrupt or assert control to reclaim space. His restraint was misread as compliance. In truth, he understood something Evelyn did not yet recognize. Fairness, when forced too early, often hardened into resistance. He had learned through experience that timing mattered as much as truth. Silence, for him, was not surrender. It was patience, held intentionally to allow systems to reveal themselves fully. Paperwork continued to pass through his hands. Records remained precise. Schedules stayed aligned. The systems William had helped build continued functioning smoothly, even as his visible role diminished. This consistency made it easier for others to believe his presence was no longer essential. Stability, when uninterrupted, often disguises its source. Because nothing collapsed, no one questioned what had shifted beneath the surface. Evelyn's confidence grew inside this arrangement. The absence of objection felt like confirmation. She believed she was acting responsibly, stepping in where her father no longer wished to lead. Her certainty was not malicious. It was assumptive. Silence had become a signal she no longer examined. Each unchallenged decision reinforced her belief that efficiency justified direction. Across the room, William's grandson, Lucas Carter, watched quietly. He was young enough to be overlooked and quiet enough to be ignored. No one expected him to understand the dynamics unfolding around him. Adults assumed children absorbed tone rather than structure, smiles rather than omission. Yet Lucas was not listening for explanations. He was watching patterns. He noticed how decisions were made before his grandfather could respond. He observed how concern replaced consultation and how outcomes were finalized without invitation. The room remained calm, but the calm felt uneven. Lucas could not yet name the problem, but he sensed that balance had shifted. Silence no longer felt like choice. It felt assigned. William's composure never changed. He did not appear diminished or distressed. His calm protected him from immediate conflict, but it also allowed others to assign meaning to his restraint without challenge. Silence became useful. It simplified decisions, preserved hierarchy, and avoided discomfort. And, because it avoided discomfort, it remained unquestioned. The smiles continued. Concern continued to sound kind. There was no screaming, no visible tension, no emotional display. Everything appeared orderly. Yet beneath that order, something subtle settled into place. Silence was no longer something William chose freely. It had become something others relied on. An expectation, quietly enforced. Lucas felt the difference even without words for it. He sensed that his grandfather's restraint was being used to justify outcomes that were not fully fair. This realization did not make him angry. It made him attentive. He began noticing who benefited from the quiet and who adapted to it without protest. As the moment passed, nothing dramatic marked its end. Life continued as usual. Conversations moved on. Decisions stood. But something essential had shifted. Silence, Lucas realized, was no longer being chosen. It was being assigned. Adults often believe fairness is something children learn later, after language matures and explanations become possible. They assume understanding arrives through instruction, not observation. Lucas Carter existed quietly outside that assumption. No one thought to explain decisions to him. No one believed he needed context. In their minds, children absorbed tone, not structure. They remembered smiles, not omissions. What no one noticed was that Lucas was not listening for reasons. He was watching outcomes. He saw how decisions moved through the room without ever stopping at his grandfather. He noticed how William adapted smoothly while others finalized plans. There were no announcements, no formal exclusions. The shift lived inside timing. Someone else spoke first. Someone else concluded. William adjusted. That pattern repeated often enough to feel intentional, even if it was never stated. Lucas learned early that silence made decisions easier for authority. When no one questioned direction, everything moved faster. Calm replaced accountability. Politeness replaced examination. There was no confrontation to react against, no emotional display to interrupt the flow. That absence made the imbalance harder to see for those benefiting from it. To Lucas, however, the quiet felt heavy rather than neutral. William continued his routines without complaint. He reviewed paperwork with the same precision, honored schedules with the same discipline, and carried himself with unchanged composure. Nothing about his behavior suggested distress. That steadiness reassured everyone else. It made them believe nothing was missing. Lucas sensed something different. He saw that calm did not equal agreement. It only made assumption more comfortable. No one explained why William's input was no longer sought. Expectations were implied, never stated. They traveled through tone and timing rather than words. That made them difficult to challenge. Unspoken rules often feel natural simply because no one names them. Lucas felt the weight of those unspoken rules settle into the room each time his grandfather's voice went unused. He began paying attention to how often silence replaced discussion. He noticed how quickly decisions were framed as practical necessities rather than choices. Concern softened every outcome, making imbalance feel reasonable. Smiles reassured everyone that nothing unfair was happening. Lucas recognized how easily kindness could coexist with inequity. The absence of conflict did not mean the presence of fairness. Something felt off, though he could not yet give it language. It was not dramatic or loud. It was subtle, like a floor slightly tilted. You could stand on it but never fully relax. That feeling stayed with him. It did not demand action. It demanded attention. Lucas began distinguishing silence from agreement without anyone teaching him how. He noticed that his grandfather's quiet did not change outcomes, only the justification for them. Silence removed the need for negotiation. It allowed authority to move quickly, without explanation. Lucas realized that silence, in this context, was being used as a tool rather than respected as a choice. That realization formed quietly, without anger or judgment. There was no begging in the room, no emotional dumping, no visible struggle. Everything remained composed. That composure made the unfairness harder to detect. Lucas learned that fairness is often skipped not because it is complicated, but because it is inconvenient. Silence makes inconvenience easier to ignore. William never corrected these assumptions. He did not teach Lucas directly. He did not explain why he waited or how he thought. His example did the teaching instead. Lucas observed that restraint did not mean surrender and calm did not mean agreement. He began to understand that fairness could exist quietly, waiting for the right moment to surface. Because no one explained the situation, Lucas had to trust his own perception. No adult framed the moment for him. No narrative was offered to guide his understanding. That absence became a strange gift. It allowed him to recognize imbalance without adopting someone else's justification. Emotional awareness formed without instruction, grounded in observation rather than emotion. Lucas felt no urge to confront anyone. He did not feel resentment toward his mother or frustration toward his grandfather. What he felt was clarity. Fairness was missing, not because no one spoke, but because silence had been misused. That clarity settled into him gently, shaping how he understood authority and restraint. William's dignity remained intact throughout all of this. He did not appear diminished by silence. Yet Lucas began to understand something important. Dignity and fairness were not the same thing. One could exist without the other. A person could endure with grace and still be treated unjustly. That distinction deepened Lucas's understanding of justice more than any explanation could have. The household continued functioning smoothly. Meals were shared. Routines held. Nothing outwardly changed. That smoothness confirmed how easily unfairness could become normal. Lucas learned that systems often favor those who benefit from silence. That realization did not harden him. It made him patient. He started watching patterns instead of moments. He paid attention to who adapted and who decided. He noticed how often silence was interpreted as consent. He saw how authority assumed quiet people had nothing to add. These observations did not turn into anger. They turned into awareness. William's presence remained steady, unchanged by what others assumed. Lucas sensed that his grandfather was not unaware of the imbalance. He felt that the silence carried intention, shaped by experience rather than fear. William was waiting, not yielding. That distinction mattered. As days passed, the feeling that something was missing became more defined. Lucas could not yet articulate fairness, but he knew when it had been skipped. He understood that the problem was not a lack of voice. His grandfather had one. The problem was that fairness had been quietly set aside to preserve comfort. The room never announced this shift. No one acknowledged it aloud. That made it more powerful. Lucas learned that unfairness often survives because it is polite. It hides behind calm. It moves forward without resistance because no one wants to disturb the peace. By the time Lucas recognized this pattern fully, something else had formed alongside it. Patience. He understood that noticing mattered more than reacting. That remembering mattered more than interrupting. Silence, he realized, could be endured without being accepted. As the moments continued without comment, Lucas carried the awareness with him. He understood now that fairness does not always disappear loudly. Sometimes it is simply skipped, quietly and repeatedly, until someone notices. And Lucas noticed. He realized that what was missing in the room was not voice. It was fairness. Time rarely announces what it is changing. It moves softly, repeating patterns until they no longer feel like choices but facts of life. As Lucas grew older, the unease he once felt as a child did not disappear. Instead, it sharpened. What had once felt confusing slowly became recognizable. The family moved forward without revisiting earlier moments, and the quiet arrangements that favored some voices over others settled into routine. What began as assumption hardened into structure. Evelyn's confidence solidified with time. What had once required effort now felt automatic. She no longer noticed how often she spoke for her father or finalized decisions without his input. It felt efficient, even considerate. Silence had been present for so long that it no longer registered as absence. It became part of the environment, as dependable and unquestioned as the furniture in the room. Stability reinforced her certainty, and certainty erased curiosity. William's silence followed a similar path. What had once been understood as restraint gradually became routine. He continued his days with the same discipline, reviewing paperwork, maintaining records, honoring schedules. Nothing in his behavior suggested withdrawal or confusion. Yet the consistency of his silence allowed others to assume permanence. Patience, repeated long enough, is often mistaken for preference. What was once deliberate began to be treated as natural. Family systems adapted easily to this arrangement. Roles clarified themselves without discussion. Authority flowed predictably in one direction. Decisions were announced rather than shaped, accepted rather than examined. Because everything functioned without conflict, the imbalance felt justified. Stability was mistaken for justice. Comfort convinced everyone that fairness had already been achieved, even as it was quietly postponed. Lucas noticed how easily silence protected comfort. When no one challenged direction, everything moved smoothly. Calm replaced accountability. Politeness replaced reflection. The absence of tension reassured those who benefited from the arrangement. For Lucas, that calm carried a different meaning. He began to see that silence did not merely coexist with authority. It sustained it. As he moved beyond his family into other environments, the pattern followed him. Quiet people were overlooked. Polite restraint was misread as agreement. Systems favored those who filled space rather than those who preserved it. The familiarity of these moments confirmed what he had sensed early on. This was not personal. It was systemic. Silence was being used the same way everywhere. Observation replaced reaction for Lucas during this time. He no longer felt compelled to respond emotionally to imbalance. Instead, he watched how repetition shaped expectation. He noticed how silence was used to justify decisions already made. He saw how fairness could be delayed indefinitely when no one insisted on examining process. Time did not correct these patterns. It normalized them. William remained calm and unreactive throughout these years. He did not protest the way his silence had been absorbed into routine. He did not reclaim authority through performance or explanation. His belief in timing remained intact. He understood that forcing fairness prematurely often hardened resistance rather than resolving it. Lucas came to recognize this not as resignation but as strategy. The household continued functioning smoothly. Smiles remained. Concerns stayed gentle. Nothing appeared broken. That appearance of harmony made questioning feel unnecessary, even disruptive. Lucas understood how powerful comfort could be in maintaining imbalance. When systems run smoothly, few people ask who benefits from that smoothness. The long game began internally for Lucas during this period. He did not name it at first, but he felt its shape forming. He learned that waiting did not mean forgetting. It meant allowing patterns to fully reveal themselves. Reacting too soon would only reinforce the belief that silence equaled consent. Timing mattered more than urgency. Evelyn's certainty grew stronger with each unchallenged moment. The lack of objection felt like validation. She believed she was acting fairly because nothing contradicted her actions. The system responded predictably to her authority, reinforcing her confidence. She did not see that this confidence relied on expectations that had never been examined. Lucas recognized that fairness was not being denied outright. It was being deferred. Each decision pushed it further into the future, justified by convenience and comfort. Silence made that delay possible. It removed urgency. It allowed inequity to persist without friction. This realization did not fill Lucas with anger. It filled him with resolve. William's example continued shaping Lucas's understanding. His grandfather's dignity remained intact despite being overlooked. He endured with grace, yet Lucas understood something critical. Dignity alone did not guarantee fairness. A person could remain composed and still be treated unjustly. That distinction deepened Lucas's sense of responsibility. The emotional tone of these realizations was gentle rather than bitter. Lucas did not resent those who benefited from the system. He understood that most were unaware of how assumptions had hardened into habit. Awareness, he realized, was the first disruption. Memory mattered more than confrontation. Over time, Lucas became attuned to how silence could be both protective and exploitable. He saw how often fairness required someone to notice delays that others accepted as normal. He did not feel compelled to correct every instance. He felt compelled to understand them. Observation became preparation. The normalization of imbalance clarified Lucas's understanding of power. Power did not always assert itself loudly. Often, it relied on others remaining quiet. Silence, when expected, became a tool that preserved comfort for some while postponing equity for others. Once that pattern was seen, it could no longer be unseen. Lucas recognized that his grandfather's silence was being used to delay fairness by design. Not through cruelty or intent, but through repetition and convenience. Systems had learned who would not push back and adjusted accordingly. This realization marked a shift. Silence was no longer confusing. For the first time, Lucas understood what he was watching. Silence was not accidental. It was functional. And fairness was not forgotten. It was being delayed on purpose. Fairness did not announce itself to Lucas through arguments or emotional explanations. It revealed itself slowly, through patterns that required patience to notice. As Lucas grew older, his attention shifted from what people said to how things were structured beneath their words. It was in this quiet observation that he began to understand his grandfather William's relationship with systems and why silence had never meant absence. William had always trusted systems more than speech. Not because he lacked words, but because he understood how easily words could be reshaped, challenged, or dismissed. Systems, when built carefully, did not argue. They responded. Lucas began to notice this difference as he spent more time near his grandfather's routines. There were no lectures, no explanations offered, and no emotional framing. William never sat him down to describe what he was doing or why. He simply continued, steadily, with paperwork, records, and timelines that stretched far beyond the present moment. Documentation filled William's days. Files were organized, dates carefully noted, and decisions recorded with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. To others, this looked like habit. To Lucas, it began to look like foresight. The paperwork did not feel reactive. It felt intentional, as though it had been prepared for a moment that had not yet arrived. Financial records were updated regularly. Procedural steps were followed even when no one seemed to be watching. There was a calm discipline to it all, a quiet belief that accuracy mattered even when it appeared unnecessary. What struck Lucas most was the absence of emotional explanation. William never justified his caution. He never defended his preparation. There was no narrative attached to his actions, no attempt to frame them as protection or resistance. Silence surrounded the work, not as secrecy, but as containment. The paperwork spoke for itself, though it did so quietly. It told a story that did not rely on persuasion or urgency. It simply waited. As Lucas paid closer attention, he realized that silence was not empty. It was protective. By not speaking prematurely, William allowed structure to remain intact. Emotional appeals could have reframed his preparation as complaint. Confrontation could have turned fairness into a personal grievance. Instead, silence preserved the neutrality of the systems William trusted. They remained clean, procedural, and difficult to dismiss. Timing emerged as a central theme in Lucas's understanding. William had never acted in haste. He did not respond to moments of imbalance with immediate correction. He understood that fairness introduced too early could be ignored, and fairness introduced emotionally could be resisted. Timing mattered more than urgency. Preparation mattered more than performance. Lucas began to see that fairness was not something demanded in the moment. It was something preserved over time. The systems William relied on did not require visibility to function. They continued responding accurately, guided by rules rather than personalities. Lucas saw how this removed the burden of confrontation entirely. No one needed to admit fault. No one needed to defend their choices. When systems adjusted, they did so without accusation. This allowed fairness to re-enter the space without humiliation or collapse. Silence made that possible. Paperwork became a language Lucas learned to read. Each document carried intention without emotion. Dates aligned with decisions made long before circumstances demanded them. Procedures had been followed consistently, even when they appeared unnecessary. This consistency created strength. It meant that when fairness eventually surfaced, it would do so as a natural outcome rather than a contested demand. Lucas began to understand why William never explained himself. Explanation invited debate. Debate invited resistance. Silence allowed preparation to remain untouched. By refusing to narrate his intentions, William kept them from being misinterpreted or challenged prematurely. His restraint was not passive. It was deliberate, rooted in the belief that fairness survived best when it was embedded in structure. This realization softened something in Lucas. He no longer felt the quiet tension of waiting. Instead, he felt a growing respect for patience as a form of strength. Fairness, he understood, did not need volume to exist. It needed continuity. It needed systems that could not be swayed by tone or urgency. William's faith in this approach felt steady rather than stubborn, grounded rather than detached. As Lucas reviewed older records alongside his grandfather one afternoon, something shifted. Among the neatly organized files, one document stood out. Its date predated many of the moments Lucas had been quietly tracking. It referenced provisions and contingencies that aligned precisely with the imbalance he had sensed for years. There was no commentary attached to it, no explanation written in the margins. It simply existed, waiting. That record reframed everything. It proved that William had anticipated the need for fairness long before silence was misread as compliance. The preparation had not been reactive. It had been intentional. Lucas felt a quiet clarity settle within him. The silence he had observed for so long was no longer ambiguous. It had been purposeful, protective, and patient. In that moment, Lucas understood something fundamental. Fairness had never been abandoned. It had been safeguarded, not through speech, but through systems, not through confrontation, but through timing. And as he held that document, he realized that the moment William had prepared for was closer than anyone else suspected. Confidence, when never challenged, learns the wrong lessons. It begins to mistake repetition for correctness and calm for consent. Over time, it stops listening altogether. In Evelyn Carter's world, this kind of confidence had settled in quietly, strengthened not by proof, but by familiarity. The absence of resistance had become its greatest ally. Silence, repeated often enough, started to feel permanent. Evelyn continued moving forward without reassessment. Her decisions carried the ease of someone who believed the path ahead was already agreed upon. Nothing forced her to slow down or look back. Smiles greeted every interaction, softening authority into something that looked like care. Concern framed every outcome, making direction feel protective rather than controlling. The tone remained warm, reasonable, almost generous. And because it felt gentle, it was rarely questioned. Silence was no longer something to interpret. It was something to rely on. William's restraint, once acknowledged as personal discipline, had been absorbed into the structure as expectation. Evelyn did not consciously demand it. She simply planned around it. In doing so, she mistook patience for permission. The system worked smoothly, and smoothness reinforced her certainty. When nothing breaks, authority assumes it is right. William remained steady through all of this. He did not disrupt routines or challenge outcomes publicly. His paperwork stayed precise. His records remained intact. His presence did not fluctuate with circumstance. To those around him, this consistency confirmed that nothing was wrong. Silence made the system easier to manage. It removed the need for explanation. It allowed confidence to grow unchecked. Lucas watched this certainty harden. He noticed how often smiles replaced questions and how concern ended conversations before they truly began. He remained largely invisible in these moments, overlooked in the way children often are. That invisibility allowed him to observe freely. He saw how authority settled comfortably when it believed silence would always hold. He noticed how easily fairness was postponed when no one insisted on remembering its absence. The system began responding quietly during this period. Subtle adjustments took place beneath the surface, guided by preparation rather than reaction. Nothing announced itself. There were no obvious changes to point to. This quiet movement went unnoticed by those who believed control was complete. Stability, once again, disguised fragility. Confidence built on expected compliance rarely anticipates interruption. Evelyn's certainty remained intact because it had never been tested. She continued acting without reassessment, unaware of how dependent her authority had become on silence, remaining unquestioned. Smiles reassured her. Concern validated her choices. From her perspective, the system functioned exactly as it should. Fairness did not appear urgent because nothing appeared broken. Lucas understood something crucial during this time. Authority that relies on silence is vulnerable to memory. Forgetting allows confidence to expand without accountability. Remembering introduces risk. He saw how systems depended on others not recalling how stability had been constructed. Silence, when expected, protected unfairness by making it feel permanent. Memory threatened that permanence quietly, without confrontation. William's role did not change outwardly. He did not step forward to correct assumptions or reclaim visibility. His silence remained deliberate, not passive. He trusted timing more than urgency. Acting too early would only reinforce the belief that silence equaled consent. Waiting allowed the system to reveal how much it relied on compliance rather than balance. The emotional atmosphere stayed gentle. No one appeared distressed. That gentleness made the imbalance harder to name. Authority did not feel oppressive because it was polite. Compliance did not feel forced because it was habitual. Yet beneath the calm surface, fairness was being postponed rather than preserved. Lucas sensed that postponement was not accidental. It served the system well. He began to see how fragile this confidence truly was. It did not rest on truth or fairness, but on assumption. It required silence to remain unexamined. The moment silence shifted from obligation back to choice, the structure would weaken. Systems that rely on forgetting cannot withstand memory for long. Lucas did not rush this understanding. He held it carefully, without anger. Patience felt appropriate. He recognized that exposing the system prematurely would only harden it. The weakness was not visible yet, but it was there. Confidence, without awareness, often mistakes calm for permanence. That mistake, Lucas realized, would matter. As days passed, the quiet recalibration continued. No confrontation surfaced. No explanation was demanded. Yet something subtle began loosening beneath the certainty. Authority that depended on silence found itself less supported when silence no longer served its purpose. The system still appeared stable, but its foundation had shifted. Evelyn remained unaware of this dependence. She believed silence would continue as it always had. She did not see that her confidence rested on a condition that could change without warning. Silence, when expected, protects unfairness only temporarily. Systems remember, even when people forget. Lucas carried this realization quietly. He did not announce it or challenge anyone directly. He understood that fairness delayed by design could not be corrected by impulse. It required patience and memory. Waiting was not avoidance. It was preparation. In that awareness, one truth became clear to him. Forgetting was the system's strength, but it was also its weakness. And the moment that weakness was recognized, confidence built on expected compliance could no longer hold. Lucas understood, now, what others did not. The system was not as secure as it appeared. It depended on silence, staying invisible. And once that silence was seen clearly, everything would change. Waiting is often misunderstood as hesitation, especially in environments where speed is mistaken for strength. For Lucas Carter, waiting became something entirely different. It was not the absence of action, but the refusal to act in ways that would protect an imbalance already exposed. By this point in the story, Lucas understood that moving too early would only validate the assumptions that had quietly taken hold around his grandfather. Any visible resistance, any emotional pushback, would be framed as disruption rather than correction. Waiting, then, was not retreat. It was strategy. Lucas learned this lesson not through instruction, but through observation. William Carter never told him to be patient. He never explained timing or restraint. Yet everything about William's presence reflected deliberate control. Silence was not used to disappear, but to remain intact. Lucas began to recognize that the system around them relied on predictable reactions. Authority expected compliance or confrontation, both of which it knew how to manage. What it did not anticipate was restraint that neither surrendered nor escalated. Acting early would have protected the imbalance. Lucas saw that clearly now. If he questioned decisions too soon, the response would be procedural deflection. If he voiced concern emotionally, it would be reframed as misunderstanding. The structure surrounding Evelyn's authority was prepared for noise. It was not prepared for quiet continuity. Waiting allowed patterns to mature fully, to reveal their dependence on silence being misread as agreement. Lucas maintained silence without surrender. He continued to participate in routines, fulfill responsibilities, and show attentiveness without supplying reactions that could be used against him. His presence did not shrink. It steadied. This distinction mattered. Silence, when chosen deliberately, did not erase him. It clarified him. He learned that remaining still could sometimes create more movement than reacting ever could. There were no victory speeches forming in his mind, no rehearsed confrontations waiting for the right moment. Lucas carried no desire to expose or embarrass. He understood that fairness achieved through humiliation often collapsed into resentment. What he wanted was alignment, not triumph. That required patience shaped by care, not urgency shaped by frustration. William's example anchored this understanding. His grandfather's patience had never been accidental. It had been cultivated over decades of watching systems respond more reliably to structure than emotion. William trusted preparation more than persuasion. He believed that fairness preserved quietly lasted longer than fairness demanded loudly. Lucas saw now that this belief was not passive. It was precise. As time passed, preparation matured without announcement. Records remained accurate. Documentation stayed current. Timelines aligned quietly. Nothing about this work drew attention to itself. That was the point. The system was being allowed to encounter its own limits naturally. No one was pushed into recognition. No one was cornered into apology. The structure was simply waiting for the moment when accuracy would matter more than assumption. Patience did not harden Lucas. It softened him. Waiting did not fill him with resentment. It allowed him to hold empathy for those benefiting from the imbalance without excusing the imbalance itself. He understood that most people did not intend harm. They followed patterns that had never been questioned. Waiting gave those patterns space to fully surface, making correction possible without cruelty. Evelyn continued with confidence, unaware of the quiet alignment taking place beneath her certainty. Smiles still reassured her. Concern still sounded kind. Nothing outwardly suggested instability. This calm surface protected her from noticing how much the system depended on silence remaining unexamined. Lucas recognized that this dependence was fragile. Silence, when chosen rather than expected, could expose that fragility without confrontation. The long game held. It did not rush. It did not demand acknowledgement. It simply continued. Lucas learned that patience was not the absence of movement, but movement that refused to reveal itself prematurely. He trusted that when fairness arrived, it would not feel dramatic. It would feel ordinary. That ordinariness would be its strength. William remained steady throughout this period. His routines did not change. His demeanor did not shift. He did not signal anticipation or urgency. His trust in timing never wavered. Lucas understood that this trust was earned, not naive. William had seen systems correct themselves when given space to do so. He had also seen them harden when challenged emotionally. His patience was informed by memory. No bragging accompanied this waiting. No internal satisfaction marked each day of restraint. Lucas did not keep score. He did not frame the waiting as sacrifice. It was simply the most accurate response available. Acting early would have distorted the outcome. Waiting preserved it. As months passed, Lucas sensed a subtle readiness forming, not tension but alignment. The system was approaching a point where assumption would no longer hold. He could not name the moment in advance, and he did not need to. He trusted that it would arrive without announcement, shaped by preparation rather than pressure. Fairness remained unseen but intact. It did not weaken during the waiting. It strengthened. Preparation accumulated quietly, reinforcing outcomes that would not require explanation when they emerged. Lucas understood now that fairness did not need visibility to be real. It needed protection until it could stand on its own. The household continued functioning smoothly. That smoothness reassured those who relied on forgetting. It also reassured Lucas. It confirmed that waiting had not destabilized anything prematurely. The system was being allowed to meet itself honestly. Lucas felt no desire to be acknowledged for his restraint. There would be no recognition for patience, and he accepted that fully. Waiting was not a performance. It was a commitment to accuracy over immediacy. That acceptance freed him from urgency and allowed him to remain present without pressure. William's legacy of restraint guided him through this phase. His grandfather had never equated fairness with visibility. He had trusted systems over sentiment, timing over tone. Lucas honored that trust by refusing to rush clarity. Silence held its ground. It did not collapse under assumption. It did not demand validation. It endured. And in that endurance, it began to shift from being misused to being understood. Lucas sensed it then, quietly and without certainty. The moment was approaching. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Simply correctly. The correct moment was arriving, without warning, without announcement, and without needing anyone to prepare for it aloud. What finally changed did not arrive with an argument, an accusation, or even a difficult conversation. There was no moment when voices lowered or tension surfaced. The shift came the way most durable corrections do, quietly, through channels that had been prepared long before anyone felt threatened. Information moved where it was meant to move, carried not by emotion, but by accuracy. Procedures responded not to intent or personality, but to records, timelines, and structure. Lucas noticed the change first not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle. The atmosphere did not tense. No one seemed defensive. Yet decisions that once flowed automatically through a single point of confidence now paused. They did not stop. They recalibrated. The system began doing what it had always been designed to do when presented with complete information. It adjusted. William remained exactly as he had always been. His posture did not change. His routine stayed intact. He did not step forward to clarify his role or narrate what had been done. Silence held its place, not as absence, but as containment. Years of preparation did not need explanation. The work spoke for itself precisely because it did not argue. Documentation carried weight without requiring a voice. Evelyn experienced the shift not as loss, but as redistribution. Authority did not collapse. It reorganized. Processes that once felt seamless now required confirmation. Timelines adjusted. Oversight appeared where assumption had previously been enough. There were no accusations to respond to, no defenses to prepare. Because nothing was framed as wrongdoing, there was nothing to deny. Adjustment felt procedural, not personal. No apology was demanded, and none was offered. The system did not need emotional reconciliation to function correctly. It responded to consistency and accuracy, not acknowledgement. This absence of demand preserved dignity on all sides. No one was publicly corrected. No one was exposed. Fairness did not arrive as judgment. It arrived as alignment. Lucas understood why this mattered. Confrontation would have invited resistance. Explanation might have been reframed as grievance. Instead, the system spoke in a language that could not be argued with because it did not accuse. It simply reflected what had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Consequences happened cleanly, without drama, without collapse. Relationships remained intact precisely because nothing had been personalized. The correction did not require anyone to lose face. People adapted because adaptation did not threaten their identity. What changed was not how people felt about one another, but how decisions were processed. That distinction made the outcome permanent. The household settled into a new equilibrium that felt more accurate. Smiles softened, no longer carrying the certainty of assumption. Concern shifted from control to attentiveness. The calm that followed was deeper than the calm that preceded it because it was no longer built on omission. It was built on alignment. William's influence reappeared not through visibility, but through continuity. The systems he trusted now functioned as intended. He did not reclaim authority through presence or speech. He allowed structure to do the work, preserving the relationships that mattered to him by refusing spectacle. His silence regained its full dignity in that restraint. Lucas felt no triumph in witnessing the adjustment. There was no satisfaction in seeing balance restored. There was only relief. Relief that fairness did not require exposure to exist. Relief that patience had not been misplaced. Relief that preparation, once allowed to surface, could correct without cruelty. Days passed and the changes held. Nothing reverted. That durability confirmed what Lucas had sensed all along. Outcomes shaped by procedure last longer than those shaped by pressure. Because nothing had been forced, nothing needed defending. The system did not need protection. It had corrected itself. Evelyn adapted without protest. The absence of confrontation allowed her to adjust without shame. She did not need to explain herself, and that made explanation unnecessary. Authority that once relied on expected silence now relied on structure instead. The difference was quiet but decisive. Lucas reflected on how easily this could have gone another way. A single confrontation might have hardened positions. An emotional appeal might have turned correction into conflict. By waiting, he had allowed fairness to arrive in a form that could not be dismissed. The long game had not demanded attention, and that was why it worked. Nothing was announced. No one explained why the balance had shifted. The system changed without explanation, and that silence mattered. It prevented the correction from becoming a story about blame. It allowed acceptance without guilt. It preserved grace. As the new normal settled in, Lucas understood the weight of what he had witnessed. Fairness restored quietly does not invite reversal. It does not provoke defense. It becomes reality so seamlessly that it feels as though it had always been there. And that was the most important consequence of all. The system had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. William Carter never explained himself. He never gathered the family to clarify what had happened, nor did he offer context for the years he had spent choosing restraint over response. Even after balance quietly returned, he did not revisit the past or frame the outcome as proof of anything. For William, fairness was never meant to be narrated. It was meant to be preserved. Once it existed again, there was nothing left to say. Lucas understood this silence in a way others never did. He saw that his grandfather's refusal to explain was not avoidance or emotional distance. It was completion. William had trusted that fairness, once protected correctly, did not need validation. Explaining it would have turned patience into performance and restraint into argument. Silence at this stage was not endurance. It was closure without spectacle. Lucas sought no recognition for what he had observed or remembered. He did not point out patterns to anyone, nor did he claim credit for noticing what others ignored. There was no satisfaction in being right. There was only quiet relief in seeing fairness restored without damage. He had learned that fairness was not something to be claimed publicly. It was something that had to exist reliably, even when no one was watching. Over time, Lucas's definition of fairness transformed completely. It no longer lived in confrontation or emotional appeal. It no longer depended on volume or urgency. Fairness revealed itself to him as preparation aligned with timing. What mattered was not who demanded justice, but who ensured that systems would respond when the moment arrived. William had trusted that principle long before it was visible, and Lucas now carried it forward with clarity. Silence regained its dignity in Lucas's understanding. He saw clearly that silence itself had never been the enemy. Silence became harmful only when it was expected, assigned, or used to excuse imbalance. When chosen deliberately and paired with memory, silence became a form of protection. William's life demonstrated that silence could preserve structure without erasing truth. That distinction stayed with Lucas, shaping how he interpreted power everywhere else. Memory became the quiet foundation of everything Lucas learned. He understood that forgetting was what allowed imbalance to repeat itself. Systems that relied on silence also relied on erasure. When people forgot how authority had been formed, unfairness disguised itself as normal. By remembering, Lucas interrupted that cycle without confrontation. Memory, he realized, was a form of responsibility. It required no accusation, no exposure, and no emotional display. It simply refused to accept comfort as proof of fairness. What struck Lucas most was how balance had returned without cruelty. No one had been embarrassed. No one had been forced to admit wrongdoing publicly. No apologies were demanded. William had never needed to diminish anyone else to protect fairness for himself. Control, Lucas learned, did not need to be harsh to be effective. Restraint could correct outcomes without leaving wounds behind. That kind of strength was rare, and Lucas recognized it as something worth preserving. As life settled into a new equilibrium, Lucas noticed how little needed to be said. The correction held because it had not been forced. Relationships remained intact because no one had been pushed into defensiveness. The calm that followed felt different from the calm that had existed before. It was no longer built on omission. It was built on accuracy. Fairness did not announce itself, but it was felt. Lucas carried these lessons beyond his family. He became more attentive to quiet people and more cautious of confidence that depended on others remaining silent. He learned to pause before assuming agreement and to question systems that functioned too smoothly without reflection. Fairness, he realized, often required someone to notice what others had learned to ignore. William never articulated these lessons. He never framed his life as instruction or example. Yet everything he had done taught Lucas fully. The transfer of values happened without speeches, without advice, and without expectation. It happened through observation, patience, and trust in timing. That made it durable. Lucas knew these lessons would not collapse under pressure because they had never relied on performance. As Lucas moved forward into his own life, he did so without resentment or urgency. Remembering did not burden him. It grounded him. He did not feel responsible for correcting every imbalance he encountered, but he did feel responsible for not contributing to them unconsciously. Awareness, he understood, was the first act of fairness. Not confrontation. Not exposure. Awareness. Silence, restored to its rightful place, felt complete again. It was no longer an obligation imposed by others. It was a choice, used carefully and with intention. Lucas trusted that distinction deeply. He understood now that silence could exist without injustice, but only when it was not used to excuse it. The story did not end with recognition or praise. It ended with continuity. Systems functioned more honestly. Dignity remained intact. Balance endured. That outcome reflected William's deepest belief, now fully inherited by his grandson. Fairness protected through preparation lasts longer than fairness demanded through force. Lucas carried this belief quietly, knowing it would guide decisions long after this chapter closed. Silence could be expected in many places. Calm could be maintained. But fairness, he knew with certainty, survived only when someone noticed, remembered, and chose not to forget.